Welcome everybody to this IES discussion event on designing sustainable buildings. This is one of our interdisciplinary discussions where we bring together experts from across the environmental sciences, and in this case, across the built environment, to discuss an issue of overlap between specialisms and how we can draw together all our expertise. As we're well aware, buildings, planning, and infrastructure represent a significant pressure on natural systems, but the way that we design them has the capacity to transform our social, economic, and natural world. Key environmental challenges, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and unhealthy air, can only be addressed if we consider the ways that we are designing buildings. So today, this panel discussion will consider the topic of sustainable buildings from multiple interdisciplinary perspectives, bringing together design questions which address climate, biodiversity, indoor air quality, healthy buildings, and other key elements of the sustainable design question. We have 4 speakers presenting on different topics related to how we design and put together buildings. How we can make those buildings more sustainable, and then also how we can bring together all the myriad environmental benefits we have the potential to achieve as long as we look at buildings we live in and how we use them. Each of those speakers will start us off with a short presentation and a kind of an informal presentation, I think, as well, to set the scene. And then we're going to move into cross-discussion, at which point there'll be an opportunity to bring in your questions as well, which I'll put directly to the panelists as we go along. As a result, the discussion is going to help us to bring together voices from across the environmental sciences and other disciplines with a view to shaping our ongoing work to address consenting processes and the future environmental science as well. On our panel today, we have Judith Sykes, who has a number of roles, including as a Fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers and a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering. We've got Matt Whitney, who manages the Oxfordshire Local Nature Partnership. We have Chris Rush, an air quality consultant at Hawley, who's also chair of the IAQM. And Catherine Pinney, a decarbonisation and environment manager working for Treveth. So today's panel will be recorded and will subsequently be made available through the IES YouTube channel. If you have any questions for the speakers as we go, please feel free to input those into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, which you should be able to see right now. If you have any more general chat, you can pop that in the chat box as soon as we get started, at which point that will be made available. Thank you for logging in. I'm going to hand over to our panel of speakers now, and we're going to be starting with Judith Sykes. Judith is a chartered engineer, fellow, as I say, of the Institution of Civil Engineers and of the Royal Academy of Engineering. With a master's in sustainability, Judith has over 20 years' experience in urban development and infrastructure delivery on projects around the world. Judith works on urban development strategies and infrastructure master planning for government organisations, major developers, and asset owners. Her expertise is in city and urban resilience, sustainable development strategy, and infrastructure planning. She's recognised for her collaborative approach, which is helpful for the conversation we want to have today, and an ability to see opportunities across disciplines. Judith's a member of the NIC Design Group and a technical advisor to the Board of Homes England. She's regularly invited to speak on the complexities of sustainable design in the delivery of an integrated built environment. And indeed, she's been invited to speak about that today as well. So Judith, over to you to get us started.
Thank you very much, Joseph. So I'm just going to share a few slides. Can you see that? Is that coming up?
Yes, thank you, Judith.
Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. It's always good to hear your life history sort of presented back to you. So it all sounds good. So in preparing for this presentation, I was starting to think about what makes a sustainable building, and this is a sort of good starting point which picks up on some of the points that Joseph was describing about what sustainable buildings should feel and look like. And I think in any design team, you wouldn't get much disagreement. You might get an evolution of these ideas or further exploration. But ultimately, we're trying to design buildings to have better outcomes for people and planet. What tends to be a course of discussion is around the level of ambition, though, associated with those facets of sustainable buildings. And what we are trying to promote is an approach which is far more regenerative by nature. We are in the context of Earth overshoot, so being sustainable isn't enough. We need to put back more than we take away. And so for me, that means making sure that the homes and the buildings that we create are climate resilient. They're built from resources, one from the circular economy. They use renewable energy, they use circular and recycled water in the development. They also support nature recovery and are built for people in a way that helps contribute to social equity. So they provide the investment that we put in place provides that opportunity for social equity as well. This is an example of a project that I undertook. It's several years old now, but it was for University College London. And when I read the title of the presentation today, it's what the building that came up in my mind as something that would be recognisable as an example of sustainable building. But it's not easy to take a design all the way through into construction. And I wanted to use this as a case study of where it had worked really well to deliver on those attributes in practice. And yes, we had a great design, but we also had a really strong client that put sustainability at the heart of what they wanted to do and achieve through this building. We had the funding in place to enable us to do it, and we had the sort of local environment and the local conditions as well. We then had a really good contractor as well that has designed the building in accordance with our design intent, and that was supported by a soft landings process where we had the asset owner engaged with the design, and we had very good commissioning processes. And if you go into the building today, it does perform pretty much as we had envisaged, and it's a low carbon. It performs better than even better than we expected. But it was also delivered in a different era. And I think one of the points that I wanted to make now is some of the discussions that I'm having around new projects is we're being increasingly pressed on cost pressures, on procurement pressures. And so how do we make sure that we can continue to design and deliver sustainable buildings in the current economic and geopolitical climate? And I'll give you an example of a project. A lot of my work is also in housing. So this was a competition that we did with Homes England and DLUC. It was run by them, and they wanted to bring forward some ideas around housing which would really push design standards. So they called it the Home of 2030. It was pushing age-friendly, inclusive living, low environmental impact, healthy living, and it had to be deliverable and scalable. And so we came up with a proposition which by far meets the future home standards and is very much aligned with things like LETI, which are the industry view on what energy performance and embodied energy should look like in 2030, which you may be familiar with. We were fortunate to win that competition, and along with another team, and we're now in the process of building those prototype homes within the context of Riverside, Sunderland. It's a master plan which is regenerating the city of Sunderland, and this will go into the first phase of development. But it's only when, if the rubber hits the road, if you get into the procurement process where you start to understand how these things are going to be delivered. And we've accounted some issues on the way, translating our design intent into a built product. And those issues are to do with making sure we've got the right product insurance certifications, building insurances. We've had some cost issues as the cost of materials and the cost of living more generally has gone up that we're now having to work through. So whilst this subject of this presentation is about design of new buildings, I think as a good designer, you have to think about how each component of your building is going to be delivered. And then the other point I wanted to make in the context of the Home of 2030 in particular, but more generally about buildings, is buildings can only be sustainable when you think about the wider context as well. So that infrastructure strategy, how people are going to get to buildings, the sort of blue-green infrastructure that needs to be provided, the community infrastructure, the energy infrastructure. So I think I spend a lot of my time actually working around things outside of buildings to make sure that the people who live in those buildings can have sustainable, can live sustainable lifestyles as well. And I've used this as a case study I've tried to anonymize it, but we did some research for a new development, and we looked at some case studies around that development, and you can sort of see from the comments from this that we got gathered up from social media that places can take a while to establish. So there's also something about your meanwhile strategy and upfront investment into community facilities and to get communities established as well that has to be thought about. And then I just want to end on something about our existing building stock. Most of the buildings we know are going to be around in 2050 already exist today. This was a sort of reflection of the work that we're doing in Sunderland, and as part of the new master plan there's a new city hall, but that city hall has replaced a civic centre which was built in the 1950s by Basil Spence, which replaced the original Victorian city hall, which was built at the end of the 1800s. So over the period of around about 100 years, we've had 3 new buildings doing the same thing. And whilst that sort of repurposing, reinvigoration, reimagining of cities has always been part of how we've evolved, the loss of materials and the material economy that we're sort of facing now, it really sort of struck me as, that is quite significant, 3 buildings in that time period. And there's a lot of value in our existing building stock. And so I think for me, sustainable building also looks at adaptive reuse and retrofit to meet our future needs and bring existing assets up to the needs of the 21st century. Thank you. That's all I was going to say.
Perfect. Thank you, Judith. Well, I think a fantastic introduction, and thank you for what was a great presentation. I think that lens of regenerative ambition that you opened us with was a great way to open the discussion. Hopefully it's something that we can pick up on as we get into the questions a little bit later on. Well, I mean, what really struck me from the presentation was the UCL Student Centre case study and the importance of having the strong contractors, the strong delivery teams who got what you were trying to achieve and sort of bought into that ambition. So as we go on, I don't really want to forget those process elements, which can be barriers or potentially maybe even drivers for some of these sustainability aspects that we wanted to achieve. So things like the procurement, the insurance, the infrastructure strategy, all of which could be make or break. But I think a great way to start us off. So I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes in the discussion. But as we continue, our next speaker is going to be Matt Whitney. Matt, as I said earlier, manages the Oxfordshire Local Nature Partnership. With a background in renewable energy, sustainable transport, and non-financial corporate reporting, Matt brings a broad perspective to his current work, which seeks the systematic integration of nature-based solutions and nature recovery into decision-making across all the policy spheres. Matt holds an MSc in environmental management, during which he focused on approaches to facilitating collective action amongst farmers and landowners to deliver landscape-scale environmental benefits. Currently focused on developing a country-level framework for nature finance. So a whole range of interdisciplinary expertise in there that will be brought into this conversation. Matt, over to you.
Fantastic, thanks very much. Whole range of interdisciplinary expertise might also be translated as a jack of all, perhaps, but I think that's useful when trying to get nature and all aspects of nature into all of the different policy spheres. Nature for nature's sake no longer wins the argument, and therefore we have to talk in languages that's applicable and understandable to the different sectors, whether that's finance or obviously in this case kind of planning and design. I'm also going to share some slides, so bear with me a moment. Great stuff, thanks very much. Yes, so as introduced, I'm Matt Whitney. I'm the Local Nature Partnership Manager for Oxfordshire. Worth dwelling for a moment on what LNPs are. They were created by DEFRA a decade ago as kind of as a counterpoint to the local enterprise partnerships, although DEFRA couldn't get central government funding for the LNPs in the way that the Department for Business did for LEPs. We work, as I say, across the policy spheres and trying to put nature as an asset rather than a barrier to whatever it is that people want to do, so that it can be appropriately prioritised within that sector. So yeah, I'm going to try and give you a bit of a natural capital lens to this presentation. what am I going to talk about? I'll do a biodiversity 101, which I really hope isn't teaching people to suck eggs. Then talk about natural capital and ecosystem services, which I think is vital for understanding nature's contribution to the built environment. I'll give a bit of an overview of what I think is probably the key bit of the policy environment around getting nature into the built environment, and then shine a bit of a spotlight on BNG, biodiversity net gain. So again, I'm sure most of you will be familiar with most of this, but it does bear repeating because it's pretty savage. We're in the bottom 10% for nature intactness globally, the UK is, and we've lost nearly half of all of our biodiversity, which it's just nuts, really. But fortunately, we have a government that has set world-leading targets to reverse species decline and to get 30% of our country managed for nature by 2030. 2030 is 6 harvests away, and we're currently at about 5% of our land being managed for nature. So it's an ambitious world-leading target, and I think it's fair to say that the current policy and legislative framework we have doesn't enable us to meet that target. So we need stronger policy legislation. The built environment covers about 2% of England, or 6% of Oxfordshire, which is where I work, just for context. There's a big funding gap for doing this stuff, as well as a policy and legislative gap. GFI, the Green Finance Institute, reckon we're £56 billion short for meeting these world-leading targets. And therefore, we need all actors in society to contribute towards nature recovery and nature-based solutions. And that's why LMPs try to take a kind of multi-sectoral, interdisciplinary approach to trying to address these issues. Natural capital, I think, gives us a useful lens for understanding how nature can be incorporated into different policy areas. So this is kind of an economics frame. I was interested in the kind of language you used, Judith, about regenerative by design and earth overshoot, which I don't know if that's donut economics language, or certainly it sounds similar. And the earth overshoot is very much what I've just described in the previous slide, and that economics frame follows through this natural capital process where we consider assets and then flowing from those assets are ecosystem services, that are the benefits essentially that society and the economy get from nature, which obviously have value. So I'm going to focus on those ecosystem services aspects of that. What does nature do for us? Well, nature provides us with a number of different services. For instance, nature can reduce flood risk. If we don't use, and it does this for free, essentially. If we don't use nature to reduce flood risk, then we have to pay to build things that will reduce that flood risk for us. Nature can clean water. If we don't use nature to do that, then we have to pay to clean water in other ways. Nature can regulate local climate by reducing the urban heat island effect. And again, if we don't use nature to do that, if we don't build nature into those built environments, then we have an increased energy demand for air conditioning to reduce temperatures in buildings. So there's a number of, there's a broad range and number of different reasons why putting nature into the built environment provides not only huge amount of benefits, not only helps us address the biodiversity crisis that I talked about at the start, but also can produce significant cost savings for A, the design of the development, but B, for the ongoing running costs of that development as well. So this is the bit of the policy area I wanted to focus on. Natural England have produced an updated green infrastructure framework. And they've designed this framework really as a set of tools that local planning authorities and developers can use to help them integrate nature into the built environment. So it consists at the top level of a set of principles And then these principles filter down into some standards, which I've listed on the right-hand side there, some of which may be familiar to you. So the second one down is Green in 15, which the government have adopted as one of their flagship ideas, that all neighbourhoods should have area of high nature value, accessible natural green space within 15-minute walk of their front door. And there's a number of other standards there that I won't read through. There's also a set of maps and an evidence base which can help guide and spatially prioritise decision-making locally. Design and planning guides, helping local plans and strategic allocation master plans to figure out and integrate nature effectively. And then it also includes some process journeys, which shows how we actually enact all these great ideas and designs in reality. So I think it's a really useful tool, and I know a number of LNPs and other partners across the country are working with their local planning authorities to try to get this green infrastructure framework integrated and implemented within the local plan process. Another thing I'll focus on is BNG, which has been in the news a bit recently. So biodiversity net gain is an approach to development and land management that leaves biodiversity in a measurably better state than before. If you want to build some houses, you've got a green field to start with. The green field might have 100 units of biodiversity on it. By the end of the development, so by the time you built all the houses, that green field, that site needs to have 110 units of biodiversity on it. If it doesn't, if you can't fit in enough biodiversity to enhance the nature that's on the site by 10%, then you have the possibility to pay for biodiversity uplift off-site, which are biodiversity units or biodiversity credits, essentially. Biodiversity net gain was initially conceived as a policy mechanism for improving the green infrastructure in those new housing developments. But it also has the potential to contribute to nature recovery more broadly through this off-site allocation. So I think I've got some stuff on that on the next slide. Yeah, I'll give you a bit of context of the Oxfordshire biodiversity story. We've been doing biodiversity net gain for nearly 10 years. Trust for Oxfordshire's Environment have managed much of the biodiversity offset market in that time, and they've delivered over £1 million worth of biodiversity offsets. We've got a wildlife trust who set up a habitat bank, which has a number of biodiversity units for sale. And some research that we did with the University of Oxford estimates that up to 13% of the cost of nature recovery in our county can be met by BNG, by biodiversity net gain. So not only is this a way of making developments more sustainable and greening the built environment, but also it can contribute to broader nature recovery objectives. So what have I just talked about? Nature is in decline, as we know, but it can provide a number of services and benefits to society for free. Therefore, making sure we integrate it into the built environment is really important. The green infrastructure framework that Natural England have produced is a really good mechanism for doing this. And BNG is an example of a policy and set of regulations for delivering green infrastructure in new developments, whilst also contributing to broader nature recovery. Thanks very much.
No, well, thank you, Matt. I think it was a great presentation. I loved in particular that idea that came up before you even started the presentation itself about being able to speak the different languages of policy, of nature, of economics, and how you can talk through all of those different areas. And I think in that context really fed up all the way through your presentation. And I think it really speaks to the challenge of getting these considerations into project decisions at that crucial design stage. And in that context, I think you just did a great job of taking us really on the whole journey, all the way through why we need to act, to how we make the case, and then how we make that all happen in practice with the ecosystem services and natural capital frames, which are really vital to this conversation as the way that we think about these issues. And then the green infrastructure point, really, I think, helping to operationalize that and tie everything together from a strategic perspective. Before we continue, a quick reminder to all attendees to pop your questions in the Q&A box as we go. I'll be asking those questions to panelists a little bit later on after we finish the initial presentations. But for now, Our next presentation is going to be from Chris Rush. Chris is an air quality consultant at Hawley with more than 15 years of experience working in the built environment. He's focused on promoting the crucial health and well-being role that air quality plays in our built environment and the opportunity that buildings play as part of this. So maybe another opportunity to talk about some of that crucial framing we can do to bring people on board. Through Chris's involvement as chair of the professional body for air quality in the UK, the Institute of Air Quality Management, or the IAQM, vice chair of the Chartered Institution of Building Services Engineers, Air Quality Working Group, and council member of the Institution of Environmental Sciences, the IES, that's us. He aims to improve and is passionate about harnessing the value of air quality through the design and operation of buildings. Chris is a chartered environmentalist. He's a member of the Institute of Acoustics, and he's a full member of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, as well as, of course, a member of the IES and a full member of the IAQM. So, Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Joseph. That's great. Well, quite a tough act to follow, but I think Judith and Matt have sort of set the scene really well. So it kind of makes my life a bit easier because I can just reference back to you guys throughout. So I should be quick, but I'll try and keep it brief so we can move on to the discussion side of things. Designing sustainable buildings, I'm covering the air quality aspect of it really. So I think from my perspective, I'm going to focus a lot down on the health side. And I thought before I start talking about some general thoughts and perceptions around indoor air quality, which would be great to explore, a bit of a brief overview of, I suppose, the current position where we're at present as an industry, and I feel as a sort of society, and definitely a UK, and I won't sort of go on a global perspective because I'll keep it to UK focus for now. In terms of the science of air quality, the understanding and the impacts of pollutants, pollution, what impact they're having on our health, that's pretty well understood and documented, and there is a lot of research going on in that area. In the indoor air quality realm, air pollutants don't change massively. Human beings don't change massively. So that science, that kind of body of research does carry over into the indoor space, albeit there's a lot of catching up that needs to be done. It's a fairly new realm for air quality consultants in the air quality world. But there's a lot of research and areas being looked at currently. And that's really reflected in terms of policy as well. So when we're talking about legislation, legal drivers, regulations in terms of what we need to meet in indoor air quality terms for the health of the people who spend time inside buildings, which is pretty much everyone, there's very little there, and it's quite absent. We have some in building regulations, but it's pretty lacking overall. And at the minute, what it's left to is down to sort of best practice, accreditations, certifications, bodies like that really, to pick up the slack. We know that buildings have a key role to play in our health and well-being, and they do offer the potential to provide improvements to our health and well-being, not just from opening windows and managing your cleaning products. They can offer some real kind of innovations there. So they're crucial as part of that. We spend a lot of our time indoors. Nearly 90% of our time as individuals we spend inside buildings. I know, not looking back too far long ago, but during pandemic times, we spent a lot of our time indoors. Again, flashing back in time to more recently in the summer, when we can remember a summer earlier. For the earlier few weeks back in May time, I think it was, there was a sustained heat wave and people were taking refuge in buildings again, using them as a safe haven. I know I was sort of sealing myself in my house with sort of windows closed, curtains closed to try and manage overheating. So again, buildings were coming to the rescue. And we know that when we look at our indoor environments and try and manage our indoor air quality, it also offers the opportunity to manage other aspects of that environment, and viruses being one of them. So there's benefits around taking better control of our indoor spaces. And really it's about awareness, and awareness has improved and is growing, but I think awareness is very different to actual understanding and action. So people, I'm finding particularly post-COVID, are definitely more engaged with their indoor spaces. People understand now that they breathe, and that they can have some level of control over the invisible pollutants and elements that are inside their buildings where they live and work. What they can do about that, what's good, what's bad, is a different question, really, and that's where I think we need to step things up. So we're really at a bit of a tipping point in terms of a revolution in indoor air quality, both from the kind of policy driver, public perception side of things. People, like I said, are engaging with the fact that they are inside for a lot of the time. You know, again, particularly moving into winter now, we'll be spending a lot of our time in buildings, whether that be in the office or at home or gym or library. And the indoor space in our buildings really offer an opportunity for us to take control of our climate, unless we're going to be sort of wearing regulators and scuba gear when we're walking around outside. The indoor space is that one place that offers us an element of control over the quality and the health of that space and what we can do. And we're really seeing a sort of a change and things becoming a little bit more mainstream now. I know there's a lot more BBC News articles about air quality, and talk about indoor air quality now seems to be on a sort of a weekly occurrence, and that's outside my sphere, which I hear about air quality all the time, but even in the mainstream public media, which is a definite shift change, which is where things need to be. As with anything, there's a tension. So when we're talking about delivering this sort of utopian view of the healthy indoor space, how healthy we can take it does come at a cost. So how much we want to invest in a space, how much capital sort of outlay in terms of equipment to improve that space, to make that space reach a certain level that we deem acceptable, comes at a cost. And that cost can be environmental and climate and planet impacting as well. So there's an energy cost. If we're looking at a space and we want to increase ventilation to deliver improved indoor air quality, there can be a cost consideration of that, and that cost being carbon cost. So I think what we need to do when we're looking at designing buildings and designing them in a sustainable way is that absolutely the people are central as part of that. That's why we've got the building there, right? To protect people. It's that safe haven moving forward. But when I talk about safe haven, it's a safe haven because of the pandemics that we have had and potentially could have moving forward. It's a safe haven because of the extreme weather events, wildfires in certain parts of the world, heat waves that we've had here in the UK that are sustained, and our building stock is just not designed to cope with. Those extreme events are happening because of climate change. They're happening because of what we as a human race have put out there in terms of emissions. So if we're looking to make our indoor spaces as healthy as possible, we need to not exacerbate that problem further. So when we're looking at healthy spaces, we need to balance that against energy and have a sort of holistic view. So it can't be taken in isolation at all. So when we're talking about clean air, it's achieving a certain level of health and well-being, but also being energy conscious about that air. I'd like to introduce the term safe as well. So we want our indoor environments to be clean, and we want them to be safe as well. So it's clean, safe air that we're driving for, and that's not to the detriment of planet side of things as well. So how do we do it? Well, not easily, but the key part of it is making the invisible visible. It sounds cheesy, and some of you guys may have heard it before, but the pollutants in our spaces are variable. They're variable between types of use. So is it a school? Are we talking about offices? Are we talking about apartments? How old is the building? What's the quality of the build? Occupation as well, and occupancy patterns. What pollutants are we bringing into that space? Massively variable on a daily basis, never mind geographical basis, never mind temporally how old these buildings are. And if we can't understand and see those pollutants, then we don't really have much of a hope in terms of managing them. So monitoring is key for this. Monitoring is a key part of it. We need to make the invisible visible. In design, we need to design properly, but we also need to take account that indoor air quality is continuously changing. So we need an enhanced approach if we're going to bring about a sustainable building for the future. And this is really having a consistent approach, roping in all the various disciplines that need to work together here. It's not something that would sit solely in the realms that may have been traditionally thought of as an air quality consultant. There's mechanical engineers involved, architects, civil engineers, we need to understand the materials involved to make the building as best as possible in terms of a health focus for the individuals, but also not to the detriment of energy and carbon as well. And it's really considering it through the life of the building. So right from design, but making sure that we don't assume that everything's built as it should be on the plan and that it's operated like that forevermore. These buildings are designed to last a lot more than 5, 10 plus years. We want them to last well into the future. And with that, they vary. So we really need to take this kind of real world approach, build awareness with the people who live and work in the buildings, who manage and operate the buildings, so that they can get the best from the actual office space or apartment space as best as possible, really. So greater collaboration is key. And I think having air quality situated in a much more strategic role than perhaps has previously been had, it definitely not being seen as a, and to a degree, I suppose it links in, Matt, with what you mentioned before about nature being seen as a bit of a cost side of things. It's absolutely not. It's an opportunity. It's an investment. It's not just something that you have to do and get over and there's always going to be an impact. It can be a positive. And with that, I'd like to do a little bit of myth busting that having good indoor air quality doesn't always come with a big energy price tag. Just because you want to improve your indoor space doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're going to have to produce lots of carbon and it's going to cost a lot in terms of energy side of things. It should be absolutely seen, and this is where we need to move the awareness forward into better understanding and comprehension of the wider industry. It should be seen as an investment, and absolutely an investment. It will cost. There is going to be a financial outlay for I'm not even going to say indoor air quality, but having a healthy space. It will cost something, but there will be a repayment from that in terms of financially and CO2. And in terms of CO2, it doesn't always have to be something that's associated with having improved indoor air quality. So we've done, I've personally worked on a number of schemes where we've undertaken monitoring and we've managed to fine tune ventilation systems to the point where we're actually reducing energy while maintaining, if not enhancing, the level of indoor air quality that's being delivered. So this sort of utopian view of actually improving energy, reducing energy consumption, but also not worsening and actually improving the indoor air quality of the occupants. Again, this smarter management is absolutely key. Not ventilating spaces that lay empty over the weekend, not over ventilating spaces that actually have half the occupancy on. Simple measures like that do sound really simple, but just aren't being undertaken. And I think the sheer volume of existing building stock we've got out there represents one of the biggest savings that could be had from these, really, what that I see as sort of low-hanging fruit. It's nothing radical, but in another way it is, because it's not being done. So there's a real opportunity here to reduce and save, and the optimization opportunities are just, very obvious. But I think, again, it's the awareness of them. I know about them, but who else does? The people who are interfacing on these projects, these developments, operating and owning these buildings, living in them, do they know about them? Do they understand them? Do they know what they can do? And again, that awareness and building from that awareness and in terms of understanding, and then being able to not just understand but take action. So there's a real big behavioral shift to take as well, really. So just to finish on, how are we going to get to this sustainable buildings that are healthy? Well, we want them to be healthy and promote well-being, but they need to do that in a way that is certainly energy aware, energy conscious, and not exacerbating the sort of the current issues that we're being faced with. While we are looking at the indoor spaces, they provide a real opportunity to look at viruses and how we can better manage our indoor spaces generally. They go hand in hand quite well. And I think we shouldn't be driving a wedge between indoor and outdoor. The air we have sometimes doesn't really know the difference between indoor and outdoor. The science doesn't really know too much of the difference at the minute. So I think we really need to be considering this in a real holistic, almost a systems type approach, whereby buildings are linked up to each other. Buildings are ecosystems in their own right, but then they interact on a citywide scale. And there's the indoor air quality that's inside that building, but a building itself can also have an influence on the external air quality as well. So we need to understand how everything interacts, really, to get the best value out of it all. And an obvious one to finish on, but buildings are absolutely integral for us, and we've needed them for some time. I don't think I'd last very long for a day without a building, and we certainly need them more going forward as a safe haven. And if we're using them as a safe havens, we have to acknowledge, why are we using them as a safe haven from these extreme weather events? Again, wildfires we see all over the news, heat waves, storm events. I mean, the heat waves earlier this summer were insane in the UK, and then we moved into a period of massive storm events where rainfall was extreme. So I think we need to really value our buildings, understand how they work, and again, that awareness needs to go through to everyone who isn't just in the industry, if that makes sense, but people who are actually using and operating them as well. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you.
Great. No, well, thank you, Chris. I think it was a great presentation. I think you did an excellent job of explaining those key elements around collaboration, understanding, and particularly those co-benefits, which really cut through the presentation for me. All the way from that example of how COVID engaged people with their indoor spaces, which opens the door to, well, when you're doing something with the indoor space, it gives you a chance to make other changes, which is naturally, it's the vital point for bringing together all four of these presentations into something a bit strategic in our decisions. So I think you gave us a great holistic, almost systems perspective on those issues and how we bring things together across disciplines to make indoor environments which are clean and safe without being to the detriment of nature or climate or these other considerations. And I think that idea of simple, smart management decisions is a great way of thinking about that. So thank you, Chris. And on that note around climate and decarbonisation specifically, our fourth speaker is going to be Catherine Pinney. Catherine has worked in the construction industry for more than 20 years. She has experience in the many varied aspects of sustainability and environmental management on development sites in both the UK and overseas, and has previously worked in construction, consultancy, regulation, and research roles. She's both a chartered engineer and a chartered environmental manager, and sees much of her role as translation between these two disciplines in order to maximize environmental benefits. So we're picking up on that idea of different languages and translation again already. As Decarbonisation and Environment Manager for Treveth, Catherine now has responsibility for delivering the strategic environmental aspirations of the business through a carbon reduction strategy, sustainable design, social impact assessment, and biodiversity net gain on Treveth's residential and commercial development sites in Cornwall. So Catherine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. It's always interesting to hear, like you say, Judith, your life history back at you. And thank you to the three other speakers. What I'm hoping is that I can tie in a lot of what you've already mentioned. Joseph has also asked me to focus mainly on the decarbonisation perspective of what we're doing down in Cornwall. But that does link in with the biodiversity net gain and also the air quality and the community side as well. So it should all link in nicely. Right. So yeah, as Joseph said, I'm Catherine Pinney. I'm the Decarbonisation and Environment Manager for Treveth. And whoops, excuse me, come back, Treveth. So we're based in Cornwall. We're based in Truro in Cornwall, and we deliver new homes and commercial developments for the benefit of people who live and work in Cornwall. And our main tenure is open market rental properties in order to boost the supply of these locally. And we have a 3-year minimum lease with the opportunity to extend. And the reason we focus on this is because of the second home problems that we have in Cornwall. And we also have opportunities to create communities through this, through our longer leases, and also the fact that we manage the whole estate ourselves as well. So we are delivering sustainable buildings at scale locally. We have a pipeline of around 250 buildings a year. So these aren't exemplar schemes, as Judith was talking about as an example. These are very much houses for local people delivered in a sustainable way. I just wanted to talk about, to start with, I know the others have mentioned carbon in construction, but where it actually sits in relation to the construction stage. So if you look at building as a whole, there's the embodied carbon, which is in the creation of the buildings, where the materials come from, the transportation of those materials to site, and then once those buildings have been built, there's the operational carbon, which is the actual energy in use. So once someone is living in that property, say, it's the carbon associated with that energy use. And then there's also things to consider at the end of life. So is that building to be demolished? How easy is it to be demolished? Can you reuse the materials in a different way? So it is quite a complicated thing to think about. And as an industry, I think we are just getting to grips with this. And there's lots of work being done in this space at the moment. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what we're doing to cut our carbon emissions. So as a business, we have a policy of no fossil fuel use, full stop. So our properties come with air source heat pumps at the moment. And we're also looking at other opportunities, looking at ground source heat pumps and microgrids in the future. We're looking at 2030 whole life carbon targets, and we've looked at the REBA standard for that, the REBA 2030 standard. We've got one of our largest construction projects at the moment is called Tolgus, and that's based in Redruth, and all our properties there are EPC rated A properties, which use between 56 to 73% less energy. And we've calculated that on a comparison with existing EPC C rated to EPC F rated properties. So the feedback we've had from tenants is that, you know, they really like it. They're using a lot less energy. They are very efficient homes, which is great. We try to use local construction and materials wherever we can. And following on from what Chris was talking about monitoring, we're also conducting some post-occupancy monitoring. We've got some energy monitors in place at Tolgus that we're using to see how the buildings perform and where the main energy is being used, and how it links in with our PV panels and air source heat pumps. So it's really useful feedback for us to take forward into our future design work. We're also focusing very much on connected communities. Where are the developments being built? How do they link with the local community? What existing infrastructure is there? Biodiversity net gain that Matt's talked about already. We have to do that in Cornwall. It's been policy for over a year now. So that's on all of our developments. And we also try and link in edible landscapes where we can. And finally, we're working to Cornwall Council's carbon neutrality target of 2030 as a business. So we've got a lot going on in Cornwall. I wanted to talk a little bit about standards and verifications. So we have design, kind of standard designs now that we've developed over a number of years for our houses. But these are looked at for each individual site again to see if they can be optimized or to see what else we can improve on. We've worked looking at Green Building Council frameworks and also the LETI standards that Judith mentioned earlier. And we've also worked to REBA 2030 Climate Challenge. More recently, we've worked with the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, which is a new standard that's being developed at the moment to try and standardise this across the industry. And we've submitted some data into that process. So hopefully, I think that the output of that is due towards the end of this year. So as a construction industry, that will be really interesting to see where that takes us. As a business, we've undertaken some carbon literacy training for all of our staff. through the carbon literacy training framework, and we're also in the process of undertaking an impact study with a business called The Good Economy. And most recently, we've become a certified B Corp as well, which we're very pleased about and very proud of. So it just kind of shows the direction we're coming from. And this is more about the direction we're taking. So in order to work out what strategy we need in terms of decarbonisation going forwards, we've established, or in the process of establishing, our greenhouse gas baseline. And to do that, we've looked at the ISO 14064 categories, and we've remapped those against what we do and how we do it. And we're in the process of collating data to determine this as a baseline with the University of Exeter. So from this baseline, we can then use it to work out a strategy to go forwards, to reduce carbon in key areas of our business, what we do, how we do it, who we work with. So again, it's a really useful tool to monitor where you are and where you should be heading. And then after we've done that, we are obviously going to have some residual carbon emissions. And linking in with what Matt was saying about biodiversity net gain. In Cornwall, we have a requirement for biodiversity net gain that has been in place for well over a year, of 10%. So yes, we do that on all of our developments. And we also now have a requirement for a 15% canopy cover, which is the new Cornwall Council policy. So our development sites very much look at this and how we integrate this within the development wherever possible. And then other ideas, opportunities that are available are in terms of microgrids, which are small localized systems. They take the pressure off the main energy grid, and they can provide a more reliable supply for local residents. And they also reduce the local problems that we have of grid constraints, particularly down in the far southwest. So yeah, ideas we're looking at and taking forwards really. I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of what we are actually doing on site. Park Llanefus is in Bodmin, by the hospital there, if anybody knows it. It's a residential development, and we've achieved some significant carbon savings working with a local ground contractor there. The original scheme had a lot of groundworks required. There was a lot of level changes on site, and we've managed to completely redo that. If you look at the photo below, shows a cross section of a culvert, a concrete culvert, and the photo in the top middle shows just the scale of it with the guy standing next to it. But we've managed to save about 1,300 lorry loads of spoil going off site, and in addition to avoiding all that community and local disruption, we think we've saved about 700 tons of carbon in the process. So it's a kind of demonstration of thinking in a different way, approaching things in a different way, and achieving the same outcome. So another case study I just wanted to float, and this touches on Judith's comment about reusing buildings actually. This is one of our commercial developments. It's in Poole, and there was an existing building on site, and instead of knocking it all down and starting again, we decided to retain the existing foundations, slab and steel frame, and we treated the steel frame and recoated it, and then we've used some new cladding and provided a new space which is being let now, and it's, again, this has saved over 100 tons of carbon, we estimate. So it's a good example of what can be done without having to start from scratch. And then finally, I just wanted to touch a little bit on kind of future aspirations in Cornwall. We have the benefit of being very abundant in natural resources in Cornwall. We have opportunities, you know, for renewables, wind turbines, PVs. We're very lucky down here, but we also have a geothermal resource, and one of our larger projects at Langarth, we're looking at about 3,600 houses to be heated through a district heating system, which is linked to United Downs Deep geothermal power plant. So the top left-hand picture shows the power plant. So that's a very exciting project that we're working on at the moment. And looking ahead, we're looking at the use of bio-based materials, hemp materials, opportunities there. And there are examples of this elsewhere in the country. The bottom left picture shows biogas. There's a company called Bennaman in Cornwall, which is developing this space. They're working with local businesses to use this in vehicles, so there is opportunities there. And the bottom right hand corner shows Cornish Lithium, and one of their outputs is a lot of heat, so there is opportunity there to key into what they have as a waste resource and turn it into an opportunity elsewhere. So it's an exciting space to be in, and there's lots of opportunity. So yeah, I look forward to the discussion to see what questions we've got now.
Perfect. Thank you, Catherine. That was another great presentation. I think it was a really strong overview of how many different considerations really come into this decarbonisation question, from the baseline fossil fuel use and the energy, which people might be a bit more familiar with, to the connected communities element, which is really important, because if you don't consider it, then you're potentially missing the chance to create these decarbonised communities from the outset. So it's great to hear about all these different standards and guidance as well, and the roles that they play in facilitating good decisions, all the way from data through to design, all of which we need to do to support decarbonisation and biodiversity net gain. But despite that, I think, despite that challenge, you brought all of those elements together in a way which does make it sound very achievable, which I'm sure will be a comfort for colleagues on the call who are hoping to copy your homework in their own projects in the future, maybe. So thank you for that, and thank you to all of the speakers who have perfectly brought us to half an hour for discussion. I know we've got quite a few interesting questions already coming in. We've had some from members in advance. So let's hop right into the discussion, and we'll try to group these questions together as they become relevant to the discussion as we go. But now that we've heard from our speakers, we'll be bringing back Judith, Matt, Chris, and Catherine to reflect on everything we've discussed so far to answer your questions as well. So attendees, if you do have any further questions as we go, please do continue to pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. But what I'd also say to all of the speakers is we'd also encourage, if you do have any reflections on what you've heard from the others that you haven't had a chance to say already, please do bring those in as well, because very much it is the hope of these kind of conversations that we can get a little bit of cross discussion between disciplines as well. I'd like to start off, we've talked a lot about the multiple benefits that we can achieve, but I'd like to take us to the question of trade-offs, and we've got a little bit of this, I think particularly Chris, you gave us some of these as well, but we've had a little flavour of it maybe. I would like to talk about these trade-offs, maybe these difficult decisions which we might need to make as we try and pursue this, and how we can manage those. And I think we've had a specific example in the chat, which I'll bring us to in a moment. But first off, just starting at that high level of trade-offs and difficult decisions. Does anybody want to start us off on how we might be able to manage those? Chris?
I'm happy to get the ball rolling. I suppose it builds on what I mentioned before, and I'm speaking, well, only from my perspective, which I need to. For indoor air quality and air quality in general, when we're talking on, again, real life projects, there's always an ambition from everyone involved that they don't argue with the science behind it. They know it's good for health, it's good for well-being. They might not understand all the detail, but there's no pushback on that. They want their hotel, residential tower, individual dwellings, residential dwellings, to be the best out there within the realms of possibility. And when you say, great, well, even if we're not going for the best, this is what we need to aim for, and it will be a cost and it will be an investment. And when I say cost, I mean everything from, the financial cost, but also energy, carbon, and every element of that, and time wise as well, in terms of investing the time to design a better outcome. Where we're left then is the pushback of, well, if there's a cost, then it's going to cost more energy, it's going to cost more carbon, we don't do it. So where we're lacking as an industry, and what's holding us back in that kind of argument, that debate, that us and them on each side of the table, is we're then not able to bring a body of evidence back in terms of saying, yes, it will cost, yes, it's an investment, but this is in essence the cost benefit analysis. So in other words, if you pay X amount, it'll be an initial outlay of that, but it will repay itself within so much time. And okay, there might be an outlay of X amount in terms of carbon emissions as a result of increasing the energy, but that's possible to offset it in some way. And the health benefits from that mean that everyone's going to live 20 years longer. So I think where we're suffering at the minute is the ability to bring to bear the evidence to help with decision making effectively. So it's not then it completely rules out any kind of comeback from people. I think it's the ability to have an open, transparent, and informed decision making process by everyone around the table, the key decision makers, on that. And that's what's really lacking air quality in the health side of things moving forward, really. So again, it's about, I suppose, coming back to my presentation about awareness. People know there's something there, there's a passion to do something about it. Elevating it to that understanding and taking action is the next step, really. And I think that's the bit that's gradually being filled in, but it's certainly not consistent, and it's certainly not where it needs to be right now. So it's my starter for 10.
Let's bring in Matt and Judith. I'm going to bring in Judith just first, Matt, because I want to bring you in specifically on this other question that we've had that I know you want to answer. But Judith, I want to bring you in first, and I was thinking maybe you've had quite good fortune, it sounds, maybe not fortune, with people in your projects buying into that ambition. So maybe you could speak to what Chris has said as well. Are you on mute, Judith?
I hate that when you get really enthusiastic and then realise you're still on mute. I mean, I definitely agree with the fact that we tend to work with clients that do have quite a high degree of ambition. So it's sort of within that context will buy into what we're doing. I suppose I really always struggle with this sort of notion of trade-offs. I think there is definitely an element of compromise, but nothing ever goes completely as a result of that those discussions. And I suppose what I always trying to find is my route through to try and find those win-win sort of situations. I genuinely believe a lot of what we can do can be designed in. So the thing that Catherine, the case study that she gave, where you can reconfigure the way in which you deliver your earthworks and your roads, and there's a carbon benefit and there is a biodiversity benefit because you can give more back to green space, and there's a cost benefit. So it's trying to find those. And then where we do get pushback on cost, okay, so we can't hit the ambition that we are trying to do, but we don't give up. We say, how close can we get to that? And I'm a thorough believer of the Pareto principle, is that we use the money as wisely as possible to get as far as possible, but without trying to force yourself into meeting a target when there is money to be, that money would be better spent elsewhere. That does require, as Chris has already said, a really good evidence base, and an evidence base that looks at whole life cost and value. So we've been doing quite a lot of work on a project with Network Rail, actually, to come up with a whole new way of appraising that value criteria, so that we as a design team, in a very open and transparent way, as Chris has said, are making decisions about how best to use investment to meet those overall outcomes. So yeah, I try and avoid having trade-off conversations, try and find my route into the win-wins, and then when there is a compromise, you use that money to you use investment wisely, recognizing the whole life value and whole life benefits.
Amazing, thank you, Judith. Well, Matt, I'm going to bring you in now, but I do also want to raise this other question. I'm sure you've got general reflections on the question, but I also want to bring in this anonymous attendee who says, if we're aiming to have 30% of the land managed for nature by 2030, do we have to worry that there could be an increased need to import crops, resulting in increased emissions from transport? And do we have any mechanisms to balance the need to import food and land for nature? Would you have any reflections on that, Matt, and on maybe the Pruga question as well?
Yeah, thanks. So on the broad kind of trade-off thing, on the broad trade-off question, I think trade-offs are a real thing. If you talk to development control managers, development managers in local planning authorities, they are always getting beaten down on affordable housing. It will happen with 10% BNG as well. It happens with SUDs. It happens with all of the things that are perceived as extra costs. I really like Chris's idea of balancing that against ongoing running costs that will be a cost saving in the long term. However, most developers that we engaged, most of the big developers that are working certainly in Oxfordshire, want to build the houses and walk away. They don't have an ongoing management responsibility, and therefore those ongoing running costs are not material to them. So this is a real challenge, and I think I can't get away from the fact that the best organisations like Treveth exist and are fantastic, and they want to do the right thing and are trying to design all this stuff in. That's not the majority of house builders in my experience. And the majority of house builders will do stuff if you force them to, and that's the experience on the ground of these big at scale, the biggest multinational, the biggest corporations who are doing this stuff. So you need a robust policy and regulatory environment within which to work. Otherwise, we will consistently and continuously have poor quality, low nature housing developments coming forward, which is the vast majority of houses that are being built, certainly in Oxfordshire, and I've got some experience of Gloucestershire as well. I can't talk nationally. So perhaps jaded cynic here, but without the policy and the regulation framework, we won't see optimal outcomes in the round, I don't think. On the question in the chat, and thanks very much for that. I mean, it's spot on. So I talked about our government's world leading targets. They've got a target to maintain our food self-sufficiency at 60%, a target for increasing woodland by 1 million hectares, target for increasing new habitats for nature by 1 million acres, a target for 30% of our land and sea being managed for nature by 2030, a target to enlarge the area of protected landscapes by 1.8 million acres, not to mention building 300,000 new homes every year, plus all the land use that will be required for renewable energy to meet our net zero targets and aspirations, should there ever be a planning policy framework which allows decent PV to be and winds to be built. So we've got all these different competing issues. What we have, I think, and what we need is a land use framework, and government are currently working on developing a land use framework. At the moment, I was pleased to be able to engage with the select committee that brought forward the paper that's resulted on government doing this. Unfortunately, it's DEFRA that's developing that land use framework. So in order to manage trade-offs appropriately, we need to not work in silos. We need to consider these things in the broad. And while it is the environmental organisation that's looking at land use, rather than a cross-departmental government-wide view of land use, it will continue to be the environment sector asking and not getting, because what they call DESNES are not in the conversation to the level at which they should be, as is planning and local government, local community departments. All of those things need to be thinking about this stuff together. So again, I think it's down to a policy and regulatory framework, because otherwise you have the very real issue, which all the farmers that we talk to understand, which is, I want to grow food, but people are telling me to do nature. Can you do both? Well, yes, you can do both. And in order to meet all those outrageous targets I listed at the start, land needs to work harder. So we do need to go for a multiple benefit approach. Land can produce food and be really good for nature as well. We can potentially have multiple of those objectives being met on the same hectare of land, but a land use framework will enable that. And yeah, fingers crossed that DEFRA managed to get it across sectoral one.
Perfect, thanks for that, Matt. And I think you're absolutely right about that. multiple benefits, land efficiency, land use framework element of the conversation. Catherine, I want to bring you in at this point as we're talking about these trade-offs, and we've talked a lot about sort of the top level trade-offs, but I suppose you've given us a flavour already of some of the community element of your work in the presentation. But since we are talking about trade-offs and tough choices, I wonder if you have any insights or reflections about how we bring communities into those decisions and make, or at least make those decisions feel meaningful to communities. Do you have any perspective on that at all, Catherine?
Well, we undertake a lot of community consultation with our projects. At the very early planning stage, we're very open about what we're doing. We encourage engagement with local residents. Interestingly, I think Matt's right. Generally, when we go, I know people come to object, if you like, that's their initial stance. But once they find out what we're doing, how we're doing it, the fact that so our business model is different. We hang on to the estates, we manage the estates ourselves. We have open market rental properties, so there is the opportunity for local people to rent those properties themselves. So once they see, or their family or their granny or whoever, they can see the benefit themselves directly of what we're trying to do. We find that whole attitude changes. There's a complete 180 shift, and they're very encouraging. And our most recent developments have gone through, with backing of full planning and full parish council support, which has been fantastic. And interestingly, one of the things that people have picked up on is the biodiversity net gain aspect, and the fact that we have that on site. That forms a big part of what we're trying to do. They like the green spaces that we're doing. They like the fact that the houses interact with those green spaces, and they can see the benefit of that. And I think a lot of that comes after COVID and after lockdown, and everyone just generally being more aware of the benefits of living in these types of spaces. And also the air quality side as well, Chris. I think it's all linked. It's like all these things, it is all linked. So yeah, lots of engagement, lots of openness, lots of discussion, really.
Perfect, thank you. That was a really helpful answer. And I think let's stay on this theme of net gain that you mentioned, and pick back up on Judith's regenerative ambitions from the start. I suppose the next question takes us back more into that operational space of how we can actually ensure that projects go beyond just mitigation and secure improvement across each of these areas. So things like net gain for biodiversity, and true net gain indeed for biodiversity, but also air quality, positivity, and those sorts of things. So Judith, maybe we'll throw back to you for your reflections on how to get that regenerative element into the ambitions. And then maybe Chris, we might go to you about air quality positivity or something, and then we'll see where we are. I know we've got a few technical questions in chat, but we also want to get into this one maybe as well. So Judith, do you want to start us off on this? I'm afraid you're on mute again, Judith. I'm so sorry.
Oh my God. Right. It's such a huge question, really. But I think our process tends to start with doing a sort of a baseline assessment of what the site is and where you are doing development, to understand what the contextual constraints and opportunities are. I mean, just to take the example of biodiversity net gain, your ability to be able to do something quite profound on biodiversity net gain does vary depending on where you are, and urban context is very different from a greenfield context. So it's about understanding where you are and then plotting what ambition is realistic for the context that you are. And I've tried to do this with clients as well, to sort of plot them on the regenerative lens, which has proved quite effective, and there's some things that are perhaps more easy to do. So again, the biodiversity gain and ecological systems enhancements I have found more easy to deliver the regenerative ambition. I think what's really hard is any material impacts. So we still are very reliant on steel and concrete as our primary construction material, and until we have a really good decarbonisation and carbon capture and storage and massive sort of shift around the circular economy and reusable materials, that isn't going to change. And so in my view, most construction is still degenerative on that construction impacts point of view. One of the things as well that we've been working on more recently, which ties those two things together as well, is that is thinking about regenerative impacts a lot beyond the red line. So one of the things we've been looking at is the embodied biodiversity impacts of construction materials. So that's all the devastation that occurs upstream in mining the raw materials and in transporting them to site, because I don't think we know that those aspects aren't considered. So thinking beyond the red line in that way. The other aspect of biodiversity net gain, actually, just on that sort of regenerative, restorative on natural habitats as well, that I don't think is well done. And it sort of relates to the question in the chat, is often people look within the site boundary and only within the site boundary. And I've got a project in Oxford. I should definitely talk to Matt about where the architect has plotted like this amazing scheme within the site boundary, but has completely missed that there's a triple SI site with a nature recovery opportunity around it, and how our development could link into that. So it does regenerative design requires you to think beyond the red line and from a systems perspective, and understand how those different sort of systems relate to it. I probably have not answered your question, but hopefully I've said a few things that are interesting along the way.
Well, you've said lots of things that are interesting, Judith, and I think I certainly an answer to the question. So we'll bring in Chris next on the air quality angle of this, maybe, and then we'll see where we are.
Yeah, air quality positive is quite a hot topic at the minute. So like everything air quality related and everything we've spoken about today, I was just thinking about what Matt mentioned. So when we're talking about buildings, and there was a bit of a focus on indoor air quality, and it sounds an obvious one, but the inside is affected and linked with the outside. And what we're trying to do is ideally not have to really intervene to manage the indoor space. And Matt mentioned before about a good few examples about nature. It's fine on its own. We wouldn't need to build big water treatment stations, or as many, if we could let nature do its job. And same with flood defenses. If we sort of better looked after nature, could that help us reduce our cost and investment needs around that side as well? And a similar thing is with air quality. I think if we can focus around to deliver a benefit, we need to look outside initially when we're looking at how our buildings can help act as safe havens or protect us from the external pollutants. Is what can we do to reduce those external pollutants in the first instance, rather than constantly try and defend against them and fight against the natural world. And one example I've worked on recently as part of a bigger scheme is looking at road surfaces and what we can do as part of a city environment, whether or not we can offer improved air quality for this campus of buildings by looking at how those road surfaces are laid, what the material they're made of, so that when resuspension happens, it reduces what's in the air, really. But air quality positive is, at the minute, in terms of policy, is sort of centered on London. It's focused on outdoor air, but I see that needing to be spread UK wide. Definitely, it's something that there's people outside of London. It'll need to be in policy for the rest of the UK. But also when we think about planning, planning needs to be vocal on certain elements and quiet on others. And I see that as quite a hindrance to the ambition of clean air again. So if a developer is looking to provide some kind of commentary around air quality positive, and what they're committing to do, there's going to be a natural commercial sensitivity around wanting to volunteer to do things that they might not be happy about committing to at certain stages. So they might be limiting their ambitions as part of any planning policy. So it's good to have things enshrined in planning and as drivers, but I think we've got to be mindful not to be limited to them, and that just because it's required by planning or there's a driver there already doesn't mean that it's answered the question. There's always more that can be done, and I think that's where, particularly for air pollution, we need to be looking at things like air pollution footprints, how it integrates with ESG to deliver a bigger positive, because all these things add up really. So yeah, again, I think that I said something, so it sounded good to me.
Well, it sounded very good to me as well, Chris. So thank you for that. I want to bring Catherine. I want to bring you in at this point, partly for your perspectives on regeneration and improvement, but also to answer a technical question that we've had in the chat about Treveth's commitments on fossil fuels. So Eleni asks, does the no fossil fuels policy include electricity supply or only heating? If it does include energy supply, Eleni's interested to know how it's generated and whether it's generated on site or not. So a technical question for you, but also Catherine, a chance to feed in on this broader conversation.
So yes, it is generated on site. We have PV panels on all of our houses. And that feeds into the properties there. And ultimately the decarbonisation of the grid will feed into all this as well. So, but what we don't put in are gas boilers. We have a lot of oil in Cornwall because a lot of properties are off grid. So those are the things we're straying away from. And yes, it's the other thing we're looking at going forwards are microgrids, as I mentioned, where the energy on each of those buildings will be centralized within the development on a development level, which means that as people come and go, so you might have someone working from home one day, you might have the house next door who are out all day. People can use that energy according to what they need, and it will all be metered according to each property. But overall, that supply would match the demand better. It takes the pressure off the general supply, and it reduces the load problems and the grid constraints that we have locally. So that's a kind of next stage thing that we're looking at for future developments. But at the moment, all of our houses have PVs, and that's where it comes from.
Amazing, thank you. And I've got another technical question here as we come to you, Matt. It's around biodiversity net gain planning and assessment. And it comes from Georgina, who's asking how much you bring in techniques and disciplines from ecology and conservation in the planning and assessing of biodiversity net gain. I'm sure others may also have perspectives on this, but Georgina's basically interested to know your approach to measuring and tracking biodiversity net gain from nature's ecosystem to the building or development in question.
Great, thanks. So biodiversity net gain is measured using something called the DEFRA metric. The DEFRA metric is basically a snazzy Excel spreadsheet in which you put your pre-build habitat extent and qualities and types, and your post-build habitat extent and qualities and types, and it spews out a number at the end as to how much gain, if any, you've designed in. You can then tweak your design to influence the amount of BNG that you're delivering on the site. And there's also a line in the spreadsheet for you to put in any contributions to off-site BNG projects that you might have made to get you up to that 10%. So this has been developed by DEFRA over a number of years with enormous amount of input and influence from the ecological profession. It is, however, a spreadsheet, which is woefully, which will always be, no matter how good, it will be woefully inadequate way of measuring something as complex as nature. But they've done a really good job, I think, to try and consider all the different issues and problems with this. One of the things they haven't yet addressed, which if you'll humour me to explain, is around really important habitats. what we think the dephrometric is likely to lead to is a proliferation of mediocre grassland in mediocre condition. So they haven't been able to adequately capture the trade-off between wanting to influence and help people to prioritize the creation of really, really important, really rare habitats, with the fact that those important rare habitats are really difficult to achieve in practice. So they don't want to, let's say, just let a developer go, oh, we're losing 10 acres of this grassland, but we're going to put in a quarter of an acre of this wonderful, amazing habitat, and that'll compensate for it. So the weighting of that isn't quite right in the metric. So that's a long-winded way of answering your question, to say that ecology is at the heart of BNG, really. It takes a habitat approach rather than a species approach, and species considerations are dealt with separately to BNG through various other mechanisms. I think what's really important to note is that the LPAs, who will be responsible for administering and delivering on BNG, are massively under-resourced. So their ecological expertise within their authority is so stretched, I think, that it's really difficult to ensure that we are adequately assessing the ecological impacts of people's different BNG plans. If you want to know more on this topic, there's a researcher at the University of Oxford called Sophus Zu Ermgassen, and he's really good at sharing all of his published research. He's got loads of stuff on learnings on BNG from elsewhere across the globe, and how it's been implemented so far in this country. Of course, it will be mandatory for every local planning authority in this country from January next year. I hope that gives a bit of answering the question, although I could go on and on and on.
It's a very broad topic, isn't it? We could talk about it all day, but we don't have all day. We're rapidly approaching the end of our time. I'd like to give each of you one final chance for a comment, and I'm going to give you that and in the form of a question that Neil Gill has asked in the chat, a very long question, but I'd like to pull out a very specific part of it for a final comment from each of you in 30 seconds each. What are the good ways that we can collaborate with stakeholders? What are the best ways? So your top tip from each of you in maybe 30 seconds or less for collaboration as we think back to this interdisciplinary discussion in that lens. And we'll go through in the order of presentations. So Judith, maybe starting with a quick top tip from you.
I think you really have to understand stakeholder needs and motivations, and then try align what you're trying to get through on a project with, you know, what their personal ambitions and what their organizational ambitions are. So always take time to understand your stakeholders' personal environment and how, you know, some of the stresses they're operating within.
Perfect. Thank you. Matt, your top tip.
I think there's two things, both I can only answer related to nature. So the first one is in terms of communities. When you're planning new developments, I think neighbourhood development plans are a fantastic way of understanding what the priorities of a certain community are. And I think it's increasing the number of neighbourhood development plans that exist across the country helps with that kind of devolution of governance of planning stuff. So I think that's good news. The other thing, I'm bound to say this, is most counties have an LNP, a local nature partnership, that broadly consist of a huge number of stakeholders, all with either loose or close affiliations to the nature sector, but who are interested in this sphere. So LNPs are a really good way of engaging with lots of different stakeholders at the same time, if you like. Thank
Thank you, Matt. And Chris, the top tip from you.
I won't repeat everything that Judith and Matt said, because that was great. I'd just say clear and non-technical evidence base. So I think on top of the gaining perspectives and understanding from other people's positions and context, is making sure that as technical specialists and specialisms that we make sure we've got the evidence in place, but then it's communicated in a way that is basically understandable and digestible.
Thank you, Chris. And Catherine, the final word goes to you. What's your top tip?
Well, I agree exactly with what Chris has said. You have to explain things in a way that everyone can understand it, definitely, and don't assume that just because you've communicated it in a certain way that it's gone in, as it were. In Cornwall, we have very local stakeholder issues, possibly because we're so far away from everywhere else. But we have very different stakeholders. So we've obviously got our residents, but we have our supply chain as well. And I think it's a case of just talking to everyone and not assuming that everyone knows the situation, because that's not always the case. And we're also working very hard locally, looking at green skills and upskilling people, especially through the local college. So I think there is a kind of education aspect as well in terms of educating stakeholders and educating future generations of stakeholders. So that's part of what we're doing too.
Perfect, thank you. Well, a great series of top tips for us to end on. That really is all that we have time for, though. So thank you all for your questions, and thank you as well to Judith, to Matt, to Chris, and to Catherine for a great discussion. For now, that's it from us for today. So thank you to everybody for logging in and participating. I hope you found that beneficial and informative.